This is Gerard John Schaefer, born March 26, 1946. Schaefer is one of the most depraved serial killers whose sadism knew no bounds. He hid in plain sight behind a well-constructed mask of sanity, fooling his family, friends, and colleagues alike. Based in Florida, Schaefer claimed that he had been an inspiration for infamous serial killer Ted Bundy. Schaefer said that while they were incarcerated in the same prison, he would taunt Bundy with the prospect that he had a higher body count than him.
He had followed my case in the detective magazines, and that he had killed 2 girls in Washington as a copycat crime, so to speak. And he would tell me that he took them up on the logging road and strangled them and had sex with their corpses, and went back and had sex with their corpses and cut off their heads. He's like bragging to me. It wasn't exactly a brag, it was like a tribute. How many did you get, really, Jerry? They said 34. Did they get all of them? Or do you have private graveyards? I said, Dad, I'm the best. So he had 36. He wanted to be the best. And he was obsessed because they said I had 34. And he was afraid that I had ones that he didn't know about. So and he was always trying to get me to say, no, that's all I got, 34, you know. But I never would say that. I discerned that he was concerned about the number. And it was my own way of needling him back by saying, I'm the best, Ted. You're going to fry, and I'm going to be here, and I'll be the best, just like they said, the number 1.
Schaefer had a fondness for abducting more than one victim at a time. He said this about killing 2 victims at once. Doing doubles is far more difficult than doing singles, but on the other hand, it also puts one in a position to have twice as much fun. There can be some lively discussions about which one of the victims will get to be killed first. When you have a pair of lively teenage bimbalinas bound hand and foot and ready for a session with a skinning knife, neither one of the little devils wants to be the one to go first, and they don't mind telling you quickly why their best friend should be the one to die. Schaefer was into almost every perversion imaginable, including necrophilia and bestiality. He took a particular delight in watching women hang, slowly drawing out their agony, enjoying watching them soil themselves. Schaefer claimed that one of his victims drowned in her own vomit while watching him disembowel her friend. Schaefer was raised in a strict Catholic household, and he appeared to have developed a Madonna complex, seeing women through the lens of either being pure and virginal or dirty and defiled. With his Cheshire cat-like grin, Schaefer used his reported high intelligence to gain the trust of people around him, enabling him to go undiscovered, fool his wife, and secure himself trusted roles in law enforcement. Schaefer married in 1968 but was promptly divorced 2 years later, with his ex-wife citing cruelty as the reason for the separation. Soon afterwards, however, Schaefer was married again to a Teresa Dean, a 19-year-old cashier he met whilst working as a security guard. Teresa was impressed by Schaefer's surface-level charisma, his 6'1" stature, his sparkling eyes, his reassuring stable outward appearance. Being 6 years older than Teresa, he was worldly, having recently returned from travels in Europe and North Africa. Schaefer appeared as a solid manly presence, interested in outdoor pursuits in his smartly pressed security guard's uniform, at a time when many young men of that era were adopting the long-haired, tune-in, drop-out mentality. According to Schaefer, his second marriage was more harmonious than his first. Teresa was more willing to accommodate his frequent demands for sex, and she also shared his passion for outdoor pursuits. Prior to meeting Teresa, Schaefer had attempted to become a teacher, but had been dismissed from his teaching internship, being considered unsuitable for the role by his supervisors. Abandoning his hopes of becoming a teacher and not long after meeting Teresa, Schaefer secured a role at Wilton Manor's police force as a patrolman, lying about his references to secure the role, none of which were checked by the police. Despite failing Broward County Police's psychological admissions test, Schaefer qualified as a patrolman at the end of 1971. Teresa was pleased and proud of her new husband's respected role and attentively ironed his uniform and polished his officer's badge. Schaefer, however, was fired after 6 months for misusing confidential data, using it to try to date female traffic offenders. An officer cadet at Broward County, training at the same time as Schaefer, later recalled Schaefer had shown him a picture of a woman who had been strangled and mutilated. Schaefer claimed it had been given to him by a detective in an out-of-state police force. Surprisingly, in spite of his dismissal from Wilton Manor's police, Schaefer was hired as a deputy sheriff at Martin County Sheriff's Department on June the 23rd, 1972. Schaefer had again forged his reference from Wilton Manor's police force, and the Sheriff's Department again did not bother to check. This time, however, it only took 4 weeks for Schaefer to be exposed for what he was. On the afternoon of July the 21st, 1972, Schaefer picked up 2 female teenage hitchhikers, Nancy Ellen Trotter, aged 18, and Paula Sue Wells, aged 17, telling them falsely that it was illegal to hitchhike. After befriending them, the girls told him they were going to Jensen Beach the next day, and Schaefer offered to drive them there. However, rather than taking the girls to the beach, he drove out to a swamp near Indian River, where at gunpoint he bound them and placed nooses over their necks. Schaefer positioned them so that if they lost their precarious footing on exposed tree roots, they would be hanged. Being drawn away by an urgent call on his police radio, Schaefer left the girls alone. Nancy and Paula then managed to untie themselves and escape through the treacherous swampland. Both later reported that they had been informed by Schaefer that they were to be raped and murdered. Upon discovering that the girls had escaped, Schaefer immediately returned home to call his station, where he informed Sheriff Robert Crowder in a childish manner that, quote, "I have done something very foolish, you'll be mad at me." Schaefer then proceeded to explain that he had decided to teach the 2 girls, quote, "a lesson on the risks of hitchhiking, but that he had, quote, overdone the job. Here's a clip of Schaefer making the same denial many years later.
Well, of course, the sheriff, when I called my superior and I said I have the 2 prisoners and they've run away, right, and they're in handcuffs, we just got to go out and get them, and they told my superior what the circumstances were. Then he called the sheriff, and the sheriff said, "Whoa, this is, you're way over the line here, Jack." And I said, "Yeah, I guess I am." But there was no evil intent. The intent was to impress on them that they could end up dead, which was true. They suffered no physical harm. It was an emotional intimidation type of a thing. And it gave them a good scare, no doubt about that. But it was valid. Wrong. I'm not saying what I did was right, but they were valid. I bet you they don't hitchhike anymore.
Schaefer was promptly fired and charged with the unlawful imprisonment and the aggravated assault of Nancy and Paula. Unfortunately, however, for his future victims, Schaefer was only sentenced to 6 months in prison for this incident. Amazingly, the sentencing judge treated Schaefer as if he was scolding a naughty schoolboy, telling him that he had been, quote, "a foolish and astronomic jackass," and allowed his sentencing to be postponed until after the Christmas and New Year holidays. Whilst out on bail on the 27th of September 1972, Schaefer kidnapped 2 further females, Susan Carol Place, age 17, and Georgia Mae Jessup, age 16, this time killing them. Susan and Georgia had met Schaefer while all 3 attended an adult education centre in Fort Lauderdale. Their mutilated and decapitated bodies were later found on the 1st of April, 1973.
The murder of 2 hitchhikers, Susan Place and Georgia Jessup.
Tied them up. He put them over a tree, It had a root that was about 6 inches off the ground, put a hangman's noose around each of them's neck and brought it just tight enough that if they fell off of that root, they would hang themselves. He left them there for several days, going back each day and doing something to degrade them, sexually abusing them, taunting them, doing everything he could to just play games with them.
Their skulls were never discovered. The evidence indicated that they had been bound, hanged, and had their limbs removed and their spinal cords severed. Susan had also been shot in the jaw with a .22 caliber pistol. Also, while on bail pending the unlawful imprisonment charges, Schaefer was also suspected in the killings of at least 4 other teenagers: Mary Alice Briscolina, age 14, and Elsie Lena Farmer, age 13, who went missing on October the 26th, 1972. Mary and Elsie had been hitchhiking from Lauderdale by sea. An item of jewellery belonging to Mary was later found in Schaefer's possessions, and Schaefer himself admitted in a letter that a story he wrote called Murder Demons was about the murder of Mary and Elsie. 3 months later, 2 further hitchhikers, Colette Mary Goodenough and Barbara Ann Wilcox, both 19, disappeared on January the 11th, 1973. Colette and Barbara went missing just 4 days before Schaefer began serving his sentence for the unlawful imprisonment conviction. In January 1977, Colette and Barbara's bodies were discovered in St. Lucie County, Florida, near to a large tree and an orange crate. Both Colette's and Barbara's arms had been bound together with baling wire, and there were impression marks left on the branches of the tree. From the positioning of the crate, it had been used as a seat while Colette and Barbara hung from the tree. Colette's ID documents were later found in Schaefer's possessions. After the bodies of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup were discovered on the 1st of April 1973, due to the similarities to the abduction of Nancy Trotter and Paula Wells, and as Susan Place's mother had identified Schaefer as being the last person seen with her daughter, search warrants were promptly authorised for the search of Schaefer's home and vehicle, and also his mother's Fort Lauderdale residence. The warrants were executed just weeks before Schaefer was due to be released for the abduction of Nancy and Paula. The police found evidence, including discovering human teeth and bone, implicating Schaefer in the murder of numerous women. Jewellery belonging to Susan Place was found in his possessions, and also a golden box belonging to Georgia Jessup. Schaefer became the suspect in over 30 murders, but there was only more compelling evidence in 11 of those cases. A former FBI agent who interviewed Schaefer stated that he thought that Schaefer was one of the sickest serial killers he had ever spoken to in his whole career. Discovered in Schaefer's possession were 300 pages of graphic and blood-curdling stories penned by Schaefer. These stories detailed the kidnapping, humiliation, rape, and execution by hanging of a number of teenage girls and young women. Several of these stories indicated that Schaefer had forced his victims to drink as they stood upon makeshift plinths with a noose around their necks, so that he could observe them urinate prior to their hanging. Also included was a 2-page manuscript that detailed exactly how to hang and murder a young girl and then avoid being discovered. Schaefer took particular pleasure in observing his terrified victims urinate and/or defecate prior to and at the time of their actual hanging. The stories indicate that he had frequently returned to his crime scenes weeks or months after the actual murders in order to commit acts of necrophilia with buried and dismembered bodies. Several photographs were also found showing Schaefer dressed in female clothes, simulating his own hanging from a tree with excrement smeared on himself. Schaefer's obsession with hanging bears a keen similarity with a character in the Marquis de Sade's novel, Justine. The Marquis de Sade was an 18th century French nobleman whose name the word sadism is derived from. In the novel, the unfortunate Justine is tortured by numerous sexually twisted psychopaths. One of these, a man named Roland, like Schaefer, has an obsession with hanging and killing women and also autoerotic asphyxiation. Schaefer's stories have an eerie resemblance to de Sade's novels, and I think it likely that de Sade's stories were a hideous source of inspiration for Schaefer. Schaeffer's own writings were used against him to help secure his conviction in Susan Place's and Georgia Jessup's killings. Schaeffer would vacillate between claiming the stories were just fantasies, to at other times claiming he had killed between 80 and 110 women across multiple continents. It is impossible now to ever prove his claims, and given his narcissistic personality, it is unclear where his fictional stories end and facts begin.
I'm sorry that people take it in a way that they feel that this is an expression of reality. This is fiction. This is make-believe. It's designed to scare you. Okay? So I'm sorry that I wrote it and that people have misinterpreted what has been written and trying to say, no, this is not fiction, this is reality. Because it's not reality, it's fiction. And it's just as valid fiction as anybody else who writes good, scary stuff. That's scary. At least it scares me. Doesn't it? Isn't it scary?
Schaeffer's mind-numbingly grotesque stories and some of his hideous drawings were later published. The stories, which his former high school girlfriend and true crime author Sandra London helped him publish, provide a chilling and disturbing insight into the workings of a mind entirely detached from humanity and any notion of beauty, finding pleasure in only death, suffering, and decay.
He was normal except that he had a compulsion to kill. And when he told me about his urge to kill, his desires to kill that he was struggling with, I personally could not deal with that. I was 17 when I left him.
Urge to kill, his desires to kill,
Police also found numerous guns, hunting knives, and a rope with a hook on it, and also magazine pictures of women where Schaeffer had drawn on them, showing them urinating, bound with ropes, hanging from trees or a gallows, or with bullet wounds. It was also discovered that Schaeffer had given a suede purse belonging to Georgia Jessup to his wife Teresa. Teresa informed the police that Schaeffer had given her the item as a gift the previous year, and that he had attempted to persuade her to discard the item when he learned that Susan and Georgia had been found, claiming that he was worried that he might be wrongly accused of their murders if the purse was found in her possession.
How does the defendant plead?
Teresa, his mother, and his family stood firmly behind Schaeffer, despite his earlier conviction for the abduction of Nancy and Paula. Teresa and his mother testified in his defense at court, and Teresa was seen kissing and cuddling the ever-grinning Schaeffer during breaks in the trial. The police had made a reenactment video with Nancy and Paula, the two girls who had so fortuitously escaped Schaeffer's clutches. This was shown to the jury during his trial, which undoubtedly helped to seal Schaeffer's fate. Oddly, Schaeffer's defense attorney, Elton Swartz, who was 24 years older than Teresa, announced shortly after Schaeffer's conviction that he and Teresa were to marry. Despite the seeming betrayal, Schaeffer allowed Swartz to handle his appeal, but by the 1990s he had started to try to use Teresa and Swartz's relationship as a basis for a retrial, arguing that he had been sold out by Swartz.
That's what I'm saying. And it was through the miscegenations of my trial attorney who asked my wife to marry him right after I was convicted. Are you going to believe that there was nothing going on? That I was convicted and the same day I was convicted, hey, let's get married, Mrs. Schaefer. There was no romance? Come on, man, give me a break, right?
Despite the considerable evidence tying Schaeffer to numerous other murders, Schaeffer was only ever tried and convicted for the two murders of Susan and Georgia, as it was felt these convictions would keep him away from the public forever. Schaeffer managed to avoid the death penalty, or at least one imposed by the state, as Susan and Georgia had been killed just 4 days before Florida passed a new law reinstituting the death penalty for murder. Schaeffer was sentenced to 2 concurrent terms of life imprisonment. Although the state of Florida was unable to remove Schaeffer from this mortal coil, retribution came in 1995 in the form of double-convicted murderer Vincent Riviera. While in prison, Schaeffer had been informing on his fellow prisoners to the authorities and was seen as a rat, but the reasons for Riviera's actions were never clear. It was reported that Riviera and Schaeffer had quarrelled after Schaeffer took the last cup of hot water from a dispenser on their cell block. Riviera had brooded for a while, then settled the dispute with a homemade blade. On Sunday, December the 3rd, prison guards found Schaefer slaughtered in his cell. His throat was slashed and he'd been stabbed 42 times around the head, neck and eyes, bringing what most might view as a well-deserved end to one of Mother Nature's most despicable and perverse creations. Thank you for listening this far, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, then please don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss out when I post again. It would also be great to hear what you thought in the comments below. Thank you and take care.